Hi, I'm Joanne Hayes. At Thanksgiving dinner, my parents stood up in front of the entire extended family and called me a parasite who was bleeding them dry. No warning, no private conversation, just pure humiliation served with the turkey. But that wasn't the worst part. When I excused myself to the bathroom, I came back to find my mother stirring something into my gravy with a knowing smile. Pills, crushed up and mixed right in, thinking I was too stupid to notice. But here's what. They didn't know. I had one phone number that could change everything. One person they feared more than anyone else in this world. So I stepped outside, made that call, and said just 4 words. It's time to come home. Why was I worthless trash to my own parents, but the key to someone else's empire? What happens when the family parasite turns out to control the very thing keeping their world together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn leaves crunched under my tires as I pulled into the circular driveway of the Thornbridge estate. The massive Georgian colonial loomed against the gray November sky, its brick facade weathered but imposing. This had been my childhood prison disguised as privilege, and every window seemed to stare down at me with the same judgment I remembered from 17 years of living here. I sat in my car for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel. Through the tall windows, I could see the warm glow of the dining room where the family was already gathering for Thanksgiving. Shadows moved back and forth behind the sheer curtains, my parents orchestrating their annual performance of familial perfection. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, 32 years old, pulling up to my childhood home in a car that cost more than most people's houses, wearing a watch that could pay off student loans, carrying a purse that contained more cash than my parents saw in a month. Yet, to them, I would always be the disappointment, the failure, the burden they wished they could finally shed. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. Try to look presentable today. Lucan's new girlfriend is coming and she works in finance. Professional appearance matters. I almost laughed. If she only knew. If any of them knew. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother, Veronica Hayes, stood there in her perfectly pressed apron over a designer dress that screamed, "I'm wealthy but humble." Her smile was the same brittle thing I'd known my entire life. Practiced, calculated, never quite reaching her eyes. "Joanne, you made it." She looked me up and down, taking inventory of my appearance like she was checking off items on a mental list. "Your hair looks different. And that outfit. Well, I suppose it's creative." I was wearing a simple but elegant black dress that cost more than her monthly grocery budget, paired with understated jewelry that she would have recognized as expensive if she'd bothered to learn anything about quality. But to Veronica Hayes, if it wasn't covered in obvious logos or bought from the 3 stores she deemed acceptable, it was suspect. "Hello, Mother. The house looks lovely." And it did. She'd outdone herself this year with the decorations. Autumn. Wreaths on every door, carefully arranged gourds and pumpkins. The kind of Pinterest-perfect setup that screamed, "Look how together we are," to anyone who might be watching. Which was always the point with my parents. Everything was for show. Inside, the house smelled like sage and roasted turkey, wood polish, and my mother's expensive perfume. The familiar scents should have felt like coming home, but instead, they felt like stepping back into a role I'd outgrown long ago. The dutiful daughter, the grateful recipient of their generosity, the family project they just couldn't seem to fix. My father, Kelvin Hayes, emerged from his study with a tumbler of whiskey already in hand, even though it was barely 2 in the afternoon. He was a tall man who'd once been handsome, but now carried the soft edges of too many business lunches and too little exercise. His hair was silver at the temples, in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old, and he wore his success like a perfectly tailored suit. "There she is," he announced to no one in particular. "Our wandering daughter returns." There was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten. Not warmth. Not even the cool tolerance I usually received. Something sharper. Something that suggested this Thanksgiving might be different from the others. "Hello, Dad." He nodded curtly and returned to his drink. No hug, no genuine smile. Just acknowledgement that I had fulfilled my obligation to appear. The living room was already populated with the usual suspects. My older brother Lucan stood by the fireplace, one arm around a petite blonde woman I didn't recognize. She was pretty in the way that men like Lucan preferred, obvious and uncomplicated, with big eyes that hung on his every word like he was dispensing profound wisdom instead of recycled opinions he'd heard on financial news shows. Joanne, Lucan's voice boomed across the room with forced cheer. "Come meet Dahlia. Dahlia Quenrick. This is my sister I was telling you about." The look that passed between them told me exactly what he'd been telling her about me. Poor Joanne. The family disappointment. The one who never quite got her act together. Dahlia extended a manicured hand with a smile that was professionally warm. "So nice to meet you. Lucan tells me you're an artist?" The way she said artist made it sound like a hobby, a phase, something that real adults eventually grew out of. "Among other things," I replied carefully. "That's so fun. I've always admired creative people. It must be nice to not have to worry about things like deadlines and bottom lines." Lucan chuckled. "Joanne's always been the free spirit of the family. Haven't you, sis?" Free spirit. That was the polite way they'd learned to say irresponsible drain on family resources. My Aunt Sylvan arrived next, sweeping in with her usual dramatic flair. She was my mother's younger sister, never married, always dressed like she was attending a gallery opening instead of a family dinner. She air-kissed me on both cheeks and immediately launched into a monologue about her latest trip to Europe, where she'd discovered some obscure artist whose work was absolutely revolutionary. "You'd love him, Joanne. Very avant-garde. Of course, he's completely unknown here, but I have an eye for these things. I bought 3 of his pieces. Investment pieces, you understand." This was Sylwan's way of establishing her cultural superiority, while simultaneously reminding everyone that she had money to spend on art that might never appreciate in value. Unlike some people in the family who just made art and expected others to support them. The last to arrive were my cousins Conan and Mira, Sylwan's nephew and niece from her late brother. They were both successful in the conventional sense. Conan was a lawyer. Mira worked in marketing for a tech company. They were polite but distant with me, the way you might treat a distant relative's troubled offspring at a family gathering. As we all settled into the formal dining room, I noticed the seating arrangement. I was placed at the far end of the table, between Sylwan and Conan's empty chair, while Lucan and Dahlia were positioned near my parents like honored guests. The message was clear. I was family, but barely. The table was set with my mother's finest, china, the pattern she'd inherited from her own mother and guarded like crown jewels. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier overhead, and the centerpiece was a masterwork of autumn flowers and candles that probably cost more than most people spent on their entire Thanksgiving meal. It was beautiful and cold and perfect, just like everything else in the Hayes family world. As my mother brought out the first course, butternut squash soup with some kind of foam that she'd learned to make in a cooking class, the conversation flowed in the predictable directions. Business, investments, property values. The kind of topics that allowed everyone to subtly compete while maintaining the pretense of casual conversation. "The market's been very good to us this year," my father announced, swirling his wine. "Very good indeed. Kelvin's been expanding the portfolio, haven't you, darling?" My mother nodded approvingly. "We're considering a place in Aspen for the skiing season?" "How wonderful," Dahlia gushed. "Lucan mentioned you might be looking at mountain properties. I have some clients who've made excellent investments in Colorado." And so it went. A careful dance of status and achievement, with each participant trying to establish their place in the hierarchy. I remained silent, eating my soup and watching the performance with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. But I could feel something building. There was an undercurrent of tension that went beyond the usual family dynamics. Glances were being exchanged. My parents seemed unusually focused on establishing their success, their stability, their position as responsible adults who'd built something meaningful. It felt like they were building a case for something, and I was starting to suspect I knew what that something might be. The revelation would come with the main course. It always did in the Hayes family. They preferred to serve their most cutting remarks with the turkey when everyone was trapped at the table and there was nowhere to run. The main course arrived with the same theatrical precision that marked everything my mother did. She directed the serving like a conductor leading an orchestra, making sure each dish was positioned exactly where it should be, each garnish arranged just so. The turkey was golden brown and perfect, surrounded by an array of side dishes that looked like they belonged in a food magazine. "Everything looks absolutely divine, Veronica," Aunt Sylvan declared, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "You really have outdone yourself this year." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother practically glowed under the praise. This was her stage, her moment to shine, and she performed her role of gracious hostess with the skill of someone who'd been preparing for it her entire life. As the food was passed around the table, the conversation settled into familiar patterns. Lucan dominated most of the discussion, holding forth on market trends and investment strategies with the confidence of someone who believed his MBA made him an expert on everything financial. Dahlia hung on his every word, occasionally contributing observations that were clearly designed to showcase her own professional credentials. "The regulatory environment is really the key factor people don't consider," Lucan was saying, cutting into his turkey with precise movements. "Most investors just look at the surface numbers, but if you understand the underlying policy implications..." He continued like this for several minutes, using enough financial jargon to impress Dahlia while saying essentially nothing of substance. I'd heard variations of this speech at every family gathering for the past 5 years. The details changed, but the underlying message remained the same. Lucan was successful, sophisticated, and definitely not the kind of person who made poor life choices, unlike some people at the table. "What about you, Joanne?" Dahlia asked during a brief pause in Lucan's monologue. "Are you following the markets at all? I imagine artists might have different investment strategies." The way she said it made it clear she assumed I didn't have any investments to strategize about. Artists, in her world, were people who lived paycheck to paycheck and worried about rent, not portfolio diversification. "I keep track of things," I replied neutrally. "That's smart. Even creative types need to think about their financial future. Especially these days, when the arts are so unpredictable." Unpredictable. Another polite word for unreliable. Irresponsible. Childish. My father leaned forward slightly. "Speaking of financial futures, we've been meaning to have a conversation with you, Joanne, about your situation." There it was. I could feel the entire table tense up, everyone suddenly very interested in their cranberry sauce. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, the real reason I'd been summoned to this family performance. My situation? Well, yes. My mother's voice had taken on that carefully modulated tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. "We've been concerned about your lifestyle choices, your financial stability. We know things have been difficult," my father added, his voice carrying that note of paternal authority that had intimidated me as a teenager, but now just sounded pompous. "The artistic path isn't easy. We understand that." Lucan nodded sagely, as if he'd personally struggled through the challenges of creative life, instead of following the most conventional career path imaginable. It takes courage to pursue something unconventional, but there comes a time when you have to be realistic about your prospects. Conan, who'd been silent through most of the dinner, finally spoke up. The legal field sees a lot of people who thought they could make it in entertainment or the arts. Eventually, most of them realize they need to transition to something more stable. They were tag-teaming me. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation. It was a coordinated intervention disguised as family concern. They'd planned this, probably. Discussed it beforehand, maybe even assigned roles to different family members. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but my finances are fine." My mother and father exchanged a look that spoke volumes. It was the kind of look parents share when their offspring says something naive and they need to decide how gently to correct them. "Joanne, sweetheart," my mother began, her voice dripping with condescending kindness, "we know you've been struggling. There's no shame in it. The economy has been hard on everyone, but especially on people in creative fields. We've seen the signs," my father added. "The way you dress now, more conservative, more practical. The fact that you've been quieter about your work lately, less talk about exhibitions or sales. They thought my success was evidence of my failure. My expensive clothes were interpreted as desperation rather than prosperity. My discretion about my work was seen as embarrassment rather than privacy." "We want to help," Lucan chimed in. "That's what family is for. We've been discussing some options that might work for everyone." Options. I felt a chill run down my spine. When the Hayes family started discussing options, it usually meant they'd decided something and were now going to present it as a generous offer. "What kind of options?" Dahlia cleared her throat delicately. "I hope you don't mind, but Lucan mentioned your situation, and I might actually be able to help. My company is always looking for people with creative backgrounds for our marketing department. Entry-level positions, obviously, but with room for growth." Entry-level. After 15 years of professional experience, they were offering me entry-level positions. "The pay wouldn't be much to start," she continued, "but it would be steady, predictable, with benefits and a clear career path." Aunt Selwyn nodded approvingly. "Stability is so important, especially as we get older. The bohemian lifestyle is charming when you're young, but eventually, you need security." "Plus," Conan added, "there are legal implications to consider. Tax? Situations can get complicated when your income is irregular. Professional employment simplifies everything. They had it all figured out. My entire life restructured according to their understanding of how the world worked. A nice, safe job in someone else's company, reporting to someone else, following someone else's vision of what constituted a meaningful existence." "That's very generous," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "But I really don't need Joanne." My father's voice cut across mine with the authority of someone who'd been making decisions for other people his entire life. "We need to be realistic here. You're 32 years old. You don't have a husband, you don't have children, you don't have a traditional career. What exactly do you have?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. What exactly did I have? If they only knew. "We're not trying to be harsh," my mother said quickly, though the damage was already done. "We love you. That's why we're concerned. We want to see you settled, secure, happy." Happy. Their definition of happiness involved submission to their vision of acceptable life choices, marriage to someone they approved of, children produced on their timeline, a career that made sense at cocktail parties. "The thing is," Lucan said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he was being helpful, "you can't be an artist forever. At some point, you have to grow up." Grow up. There it was. The fundamental accusation that had been lurking beneath every interaction we'd had for the past decade. I was childish, immature, living in a fantasy world that responsible adults were expected to abandon. "We've been supporting this experiment long enough," my father continued. Indirectly, of course. The family connections, the introductions, the safety net of knowing you always had a place to come home to. But enabling someone isn't helping them. Enabling. He made it sound like my career was a drug habit they'd been reluctantly funding. So here's what we're proposing, my mother said, taking control of the conversation with the smooth efficiency of someone chairing a board meeting. A transition period. 6 months to wrap up whatever projects you have outstanding, then a move. Back here to Thornbridge. We'll help you find a suitable apartment, maybe something in the arts district downtown where you can maintain your creative interests as a hobby while building a real career. A hobby. 15 years of professional success reduced to weekend watercolors and pottery classes. The entire table was watching me now, waiting for my response. They'd presented their case with the confidence of people who believed they were offering salvation to someone drowning. All I had to do was accept their generous offer to restructure my entire existence according to their understanding of what constituted a life worth living. But there was something else going on here. Something beneath the surface of this carefully orchestrated intervention. The timing felt wrong, too urgent, too coordinated. Like they weren't just worried about my future. They were actively trying to control it. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course, my father replied, but his smile had a sharp edge to it. Take your time, but not too much time. Opportunities like this don't wait forever. There was a threat buried in there somewhere, a deadline I wasn't aware of. Something that made my transformation from independent artist to entry-level employee feel less like a generous offer and more like an ultimatum. As my mother began clearing the main course dishes, preparing for dessert, I excused myself to the bathroom. I needed a moment to think, to process what had just happened, to figure out what was really going on here. But as I walked through the familiar hallways of my childhood home, past the photographs of family achievements and the awards that marked the Hayes family's rise to prominence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner was about more than concern for my welfare. This felt like the beginning of something, and I was starting to suspect that whatever was coming next wouldn't be nearly as polite as what I'd just endured. I returned from the bathroom to find dessert already being served. My mother's famous pumpkin cheesecake, garnished with candied pecans and a delicate swirl of caramel sauce. The presentation was flawless as always, but the atmosphere at the table had shifted in my absence. The conversation felt more charged somehow, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. There you are, my mother said with a brightness. That seemed forced. I was just telling everyone about the Hendersons' Thanksgiving party next week. They're expecting quite a crowd this year. The Hendersons were old family friends, the kind of people who moved in the same social circles as my parents and considered their annual parties to be important cultural events. Invitations were coveted, guest lists were scrutinized, and attendance was seen as a mark of social standing. Will you be joining us, Joanne? Aunt Sylvan asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I'm not sure I'll still be in town, I replied, taking a bite of the cheesecake. It was perfect, of course. My mother never served anything. That wasn't. Ah, yes, your travel schedule, my father said with what might have been amusement. Always on the move. Very artistic lifestyle. There was something mocking in his voice that made my spine stiffen. He was building toward something. I could feel it. The intervention about my career had been just the opening act. Actually, Lucan said, setting down his fork with the deliberate motion of someone about to make an important announcement. That brings up something we've been meaning to discuss. About your living situation. My living situation. Another euphemism for another aspect of my life they'd decided needed their management. What about it? Well, my mother began, her voice taking on that careful tone again. We know you've been moving around quite a bit lately. Different cities, different apartments. It must be exhausting, never having a real home base. It's been fine. Has it, though? My father asked. leaning forward slightly. All that instability? All that uncertainty? At some point, don't you want to settle down somewhere? They were leading up to something specific. I could see it in the way they kept glancing at each other, the way Dahlia was listening with the focused attention of someone who'd been briefed on what was coming next. The truth is, Lucan said, his voice carrying that note of reluctant honesty that meant he was about to say something cruel while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. We've been worried about more than just your career. We've been worried about your whole situation. My whole situation? Your stability, my mother clarified. Your ability to take care of yourself. Your judgment about certain things. Certain things. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation waiting to be specified. Conan cleared his throat. From a legal perspective, there are signs that might indicate someone is struggling more than they're willing to admit. Frequent moves, irregular income, social isolation. I'm not socially isolated, aren't you? Aunt Silwyn asked gently. When was the last time you brought someone to a family gathering? A boyfriend? A close friend? Anyone who could speak to your current situation? They were building a case. Piece by piece, they were constructing a narrative about my life that painted me as unstable, unreliable, possibly even mentally fragile, the kind of person who needed intervention, management, control. We love you, my mother said, reaching across the table to pat my hand with the kind of maternal gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. That's why we're concerned. That's why we want to help. Help. The word was starting to sound like a threat. Here's what we're thinking, my father announced, taking control of the conversation with the authority of someone used to making executive decisions. A more structured living situation, something stable, something where you'd have support. What kind of support? Well, my mother said, exchanging another of those meaningful looks with my father. There are facilities that specialize in helping people who are going through transitions. Creative people, especially. People who might need some guidance getting back on their feet. Facilities. The word hit me like a physical blow. They weren't talking about career counseling or temporary housing. They were talking about institutions. Places where people got sent when their families decided they were no longer capable of managing their own lives. You're talking about having me committed. We're talking about getting you help, Lucan said quickly. Professional help. The kind of support system you obviously need. There's no shame in it, Dahlia added, her voice warm with the kind of professional compassion she'd probably learned in some corporate sensitivity training. Mental health is just as important as physical health. Sometimes people need professional intervention. Mental health. They were questioning my sanity now. Not just my career choices or my lifestyle, but my fundamental ability to think clearly and make rational decisions. We've already spoken with someone, my mother continued, her voice gentle but implacable. A lovely doctor who specializes in these kinds of situations. Dr. Rowena Thalrick. She's very understanding, very discreet. She thinks a short stay at her facility might be exactly what you need. They'd already spoken with someone. This wasn't a spontaneous intervention born of sudden concern. This was a planned campaign with professional consultation and predetermined outcomes. A short stay, I repeated. Just until you're feeling more stable, my father said. More grounded. More ready to make responsible decisions about your future. Responsible decisions. Decisions they approved of. Decisions that aligned with their vision of what my life should look like. I looked around the table at the faces of my family. My parents, sitting side by side like judges delivering a verdict. My brother, nodding approvingly as if this was all perfectly reasonable. My aunt, looking sad but supportive, as if she was watching a necessary but painful medical procedure. My cousins, uncomfortable but not objecting, treating this as an internal family matter that wasn't really their business. And Dahlia, the outsider who'd been brought in as a witness to this intervention, her face a mask of professional concern that barely concealed her curiosity about the family drama she'd been invited to observe. "I can't believe you're doing this," I said. "Finally, we're doing this because we love you," my mother replied. "Because we can't stand by and watch you destroy yourself anymore." Destroy myself. By having a successful career they didn't understand. By living a life that didn't conform to their expectations. By refusing to accept their definition of what constituted acceptable existence. "The arrangements have already been made," my father announced with the finality of someone closing a business deal. "Dr. Thalrick is expecting you Monday morning. We'll drive you there ourselves, make sure you're comfortable, handle all the paperwork." They'd made arrangements. Without my consent, without my knowledge, they'd taken steps to have me institutionalized based on their assessment of my mental state and their conviction that I needed professional intervention. I stood up from the table, my legs shaky but my resolve crystallizing into something hard and cold. "I need some air." "Joanne, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," my mother called after me. But I was already walking toward the kitchen, toward the back door that led to the garden where I'd spent so much of my childhood. Hiding from exactly this kind of family gathering. Outside, the November air was sharp and clean, cutting through the fog of wine and overwhelming emotion that had been building in my chest. I walked to the far end of the garden, to the stone bench where I used to sit and read when the house became too suffocating, too full of expectations and disappointments. My phone was in my hand before I'd even made a conscious decision to call anyone. But as my fingers moved across the screen, I realized there was only one person who could help me now. One person who had the power to stop what my family was trying to do to me. One person they feared more than anyone else in the world. Found the contact in my phone and hit call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Joanne? Is that you, darling?" "Hello, Gloria. I think it's time we had that conversation." There was a pause, and then a sound that might have been laughter. "I was wondering when you'd finally call. How bad is it?" "They want to have me committed. They've already made arrangements with a doctor." Another pause, longer this time. "I see. Well, that certainly accelerates our timeline, doesn't it? Where are you now?" "At the house. The whole family is here. They think they're staging an intervention." "Perfect. Stay exactly where you are. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Gloria, you don't understand. They've been planning this. They have legal consultation, medical opinions. "Sweetheart," she interrupted, and her voice carried a note of steel that I remembered from childhood. "They have no idea what they're dealing with. Trust me. This ends tonight." The line went dead, and I sat in the gathering darkness, holding my phone and waiting for the cavalry to arrive. Inside the house, I could see my family through the windows, probably discussing how to handle my dramatic exit, how to convince me that their intervention was in my best interest, how to manage what they saw as an unfortunate but necessary family crisis. They had no idea that in 20 minutes, everything they thought they knew about power and control and family hierarchy was about to be turned upside down. They thought they were saving me from myself. They were about to discover they'd picked a fight with someone who had been waiting 32 years for the chance to fight back. I remained in the garden, my breath visible in small puffs in the cold November air, as I considered everything my family didn't know about my life. Everything they'd never bothered to ask about, never cared to understand, never imagined could be true about the family disappointment they'd just decided to institutionalize. They thought I was broke. The truth was, I had more money in my checking account than my father made in a good year. They thought I was struggling as an artist. The truth was, I hadn't needed to sell a single piece of art to support myself in over 5 years, though my work still commanded 6-figure prices when I chose to sell. They thought I was rootless and unstable. The truth was, I owned properties in 3 states and had been traveling between them because my business interests required constant attention, not because I couldn't afford to stay in one place. But most importantly, They thought I was alone, isolated, without connections or resources or anyone who might intervene on my behalf. They had no idea who Gloria really was. My phone buzzed with a text message. 5 minutes out. Are they still inside? I looked through the windows at my family, who were now clearly in crisis management mode. My mother was pacing back and forth in the dining room, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to my father. Lucan was on his phone, probably calling Dr. Thalric to update her on the situation. Dahlia looked like she was regretting accepting the invitation to this particular family gathering. I texted back, all present and accounted for. Perfect. This is going to be fun. Fun. That was Gloria's way of describing situations where she got to remind people that power isn't always distributed the way they think it is. While I waited, I allowed myself to remember how all of this had started. How the Hayes family's golden offspring had become the family disappointment, and how that disappointment had led to opportunities they could never have imagined. It began when I was 22, fresh out of college with a fine arts degree that my parents had grudgingly paid for while making it clear they considered it money wasted on an indulgent fantasy. They'd expected me to get it out of my system and then transition to something practical. Business school, maybe. Or law school like Conan. Instead, I'd moved to the city and started trying to make it as a working artist. For the first 2 years, I'd lived exactly the struggling artist life they'd predicted. Tiny apartment, irregular income, constant worry about rent and groceries. I'd been too proud to ask them for help, and they'd been too convinced they'd been right about my impracticality to offer it. But during those 2 years of struggle, I'd learned something valuable. I had a gift not just for creating art, but for understanding what people with money wanted to buy. Not just any art, but art that made them feel sophisticated, cultured, important. Art that looked good in their homes and made for interesting conversation at dinner parties. More importantly, I'd learned to recognize the difference between people who bought art because they loved it and people who bought art because they wanted to be seen as the kind of people who bought art. The second group had much more money and much less discerning taste. By the time I was 25, I wasn't just selling my own work. I was curating private sales for wealthy collectors who trusted my eye and valued my discretion. I'd built a network of artists, dealers, and buyers that generated income streams my family couldn't have imagined and wouldn't have understood if I'd tried to explain them. By 30, I wasn't just successful, I was influential. I had connections. Throughout the art world, the finance world, the social world where serious money changed hands. I had information about who was buying what, who was selling why, who was investing in what trends. Information that was valuable to the right people for the right reasons. And at 32, I had something else. I had Gloria's attention, Gloria Hayes, my father's mother, the family matriarch who'd built the Hayes fortune from nothing and who still controlled more of it than my parents realized. The woman who'd been watching me from a distance for years, waiting to see if I had inherited anything besides the family name. The woman who'd been waiting for me to prove I was worth her investment. The headlights swept across the garden as a car pulled into the driveway. Not just any car, a black sedan that cost more than most people's houses, driven by someone who didn't need to announce their arrival because their presence spoke for itself. I walked back toward the house, timing my entrance to coincide with the knock on the front door. Through the windows, I could see my family's confusion as they tried to figure out who would be visiting during Thanksgiving dinner. They clearly weren't expecting anyone. My mother opened the door, and I heard her intake of breath from across the room. Mrs. Hayes, what a surprise. We weren't expecting you. No, came the familiar voice, crisp and authoritative even in its politeness. I imagine you weren't. May I come in? There was no real question in the request. Gloria Hayes had never been the kind of woman who waited for permission to enter any space she chose to occupy. I slipped in through the back door and positioned myself in the kitchen doorway, where I could observe the scene in the living room. My family was arranged in a loose semicircle, all standing now, all wearing expressions of confused concern. Gloria stood in the center of the room like a general surveying a battlefield. She was 78 years old, but carried herself with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades commanding rooms full of people who were used to being the most important person wherever they went. Her silver hair was pulled back in a style that was both elegant and severe, and she wore a black wool coat that probably cost more than my mother's car. "Please, sit down," she said, though it was clearly not a request. "We have quite a lot to discuss." My father cleared his throat. "Mother, if this is about the foundation board meeting next week, I can explain." Kelvin. The single word cut across his explanation like a blade. "Sit down." They sat, all of them. Even Dahlia, who probably wasn't sure what was happening but recognized authority when she encountered it. Gloria remained standing, her eyes moving around the room, taking inventory of faces and positions and power dynamics. When her gaze found me in the kitchen doorway, she smiled slightly. "Joanne, darling, would you join us? I believe your family has some things they'd like to discuss with you." I walked into the living room, acutely aware that the balance of power had just shifted, in ways my family didn't yet understand. They thought Gloria was here for some unrelated family business. They had no idea she was here for me. "Actually," my father began, his voice carrying that note of paternal authority he used when he wanted to control a conversation, "we were just having a private family discussion about Joanne's future. Nothing that needs to concern you, Mother." "Were you?" Gloria's voice was pleasant, conversational. "How interesting. And what conclusions did this private family discussion reach about Joanne's future?" My mother and father exchanged glances, clearly trying to figure out how much to tell her, how to frame their intervention in terms that would gain her support rather than her interference. "We're concerned about her stability," my mother said, finally. "Her lifestyle has become increasingly erratic. We think she might benefit from some professional guidance." "Professional guidance," Gloria repeated. "What kind of professional guidance?" "There's a facility," Lucan jumped in, clearly proud to demonstrate his involvement in the family problem-solving effort. "A place that specializes in helping people transition to more stable living situations. We've already spoken with the director." "Dr. Rowena Thalrick," my father added. "Very well regarded, very discreet." Gloria nodded thoughtfully, as if she was considering this information carefully. "I see. And has anyone asked Joanne what she thinks about this plan?" "Well, naturally she's resistant," my mother said quickly. "That's often a sign that intervention is necessary. People who need help don't always recognize they need it. Naturally." Gloria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "And tell me, what evidence do you have that Joanne needs this kind of professional intervention?" They began to recite their case again. My irregular income, my frequent travel, my unconventional lifestyle. Choices, my lack of traditional relationships or career markers. They presented it all as evidence of instability, of someone spiraling toward a crisis that required immediate management. Gloria listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, asking clarifying questions that seemed designed to draw out more details about their reasoning and their plans. "Fascinating," she said when they'd finished. "Absolutely fascinating. And you've made arrangements to have her committed based on this evidence?" "Not committed," my father said quickly. "It's not like that. It's more like a retreat, a place where she can get the help she needs and figure out what she wants to do with her life, against her will." The words hung in the air like an accusation. "Sometimes," my mother said defensively, "people need guidance even when they don't want it. That's what family is for." Gloria nodded again, that same thoughtful expression on her face. "Indeed, family guidance is so important, which is why I think it's time I shared some information about Joanne's situation that might change your perspective on this intervention." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder, thick, official-looking, the kind that contained documents rather than casual correspondence. For instance, she said, opening the folder and extracting a single sheet of paper, you might be interested to know that Joanne's annual income last year was roughly 3 times what you made, Kelvin, and that's after taxes. The silence that followed was absolute. You might also be interested to know that she owns properties in Vermont, Colorado, and California, all purchased with cash and all currently appreciating in value at rates that would make your investment advisor weep with envy. She pulled out another document. And you might be particularly interested to know that she's been the primary silent partner in an art consulting business that has brokered sales totaling over $50 million in the past 3 years alone. My father's face had gone completely white. My mother was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. But perhaps most relevant to this conversation, Gloria continued, her voice never losing its pleasant, conversational tone. You might want to know that 3 months ago, Joanne became the youngest person ever appointed to the board of directors of Hayes Industries. The folder hit the coffee table with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the absolute silence that followed. Which means, Gloria said, settling into an armchair like a queen taking her throne, that she now has voting control over the trust fund that provides 60% of your annual income, Kelvin. And the foundation grants that fund Silwyn's lifestyle, and the family properties that you all consider your inheritance. She smiled, and this time it did reach her eyes. So before we continue this conversation about professional intervention, perhaps someone would like to explain to me exactly why you think it's appropriate to threaten my business partner with involuntary commitment. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the barely audible sound of my mother's sharp breathing. I could see the wheels turning behind my father's eyes as he tried to process what Gloria had just revealed, tried to reconcile the family failure they'd been planning to institutionalize with the business partner who apparently controlled their financial security. Board of directors, he repeated. Finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Hayes Industries, my mother added, as if saying the words aloud might help them make sense. Gloria reached into her folder again and pulled out what looked like a formal business document. The appointment was made official 3 months ago, though Joanne has been consulting with the company in various capacities for the past 2 years. Her insights into emerging markets and cultural trends have been invaluable. She handed the document to my father, who stared at it like it was written in hieroglyphics. She's been particularly instrumental in our expansion into the contemporary art investment sector, a market most traditional financial advisors wouldn't touch, but one that has generated exceptional returns under her guidance. Lucan leaned over to read the document over my father's shoulder, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. This says she has authority over discretionary spending up to $5 million. That's correct. And voting rights on all major strategic decisions affecting family assets. Aunt Silwyn, who had been uncharacteristically quiet through most of this revelation, finally found her voice. But she never said anything, never mentioned any of this. Gloria's gaze shifted to her with the kind of attention a hawk might give, a field mouse. Did you ask? Well, no, but did any of you ever ask Joanne about her work? Her finances, her business interests? Or did you simply assume that because she wasn't living the life you'd planned for her, she must be failing at the life she'd chosen for herself? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. I could see my family members exchanging glances, each one probably running through years of conversations where they'd dismissed my career, ignored my achievements, or redirected discussions away from topics they found uncomfortable or incomprehensible. She could have told us, my mother said defensively, but her voice lacked conviction. Could she? When was the last time any of you listened to her talk about her work without changing the subject, or offering unsolicited advice about more practical career choices? The question was met with more silence. Because, of course, they couldn't answer it. Every time I'd tried to share anything about my actual life, they'd responded with condescension, skepticism, or outright dismissal. Dahlia, who had been sitting frozen throughout this entire exchange, cleared her throat tentatively. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion here. Lucan told me his sister was a struggling artist who needed help getting back on her feet." All eyes turned to Lucan, who looked like he was having some kind of internal crisis. His confident demeanor had crumbled completely, replaced by the expression of someone who just realized they'd been catastrophically wrong about something fundamental. She seemed what? Exactly? Gloria's voice had taken on an edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Unstable. Unreliable. Like she was just drifting from one thing to another without any real plan. Interesting. And what gave you that impression? The way she dressed. Casual. Not professional. And she never talked about clients or income or business meetings like the rest of us do. Gloria nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. I see. So because she didn't conform to your narrow definition of professional success, you concluded she was failing. And because she maintained discretion about her client relationships, which I should mention is a cornerstone of success in her field, you decided she had nothing significant to report. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where I'd been sitting just minutes earlier, waiting for my world to change. "Let me tell you what Joanne's discretion has protected," she said without turning around. "In the past year alone, she has handled private sales for 3 Fortune 500 CEOs, a federal judge, and 2 foreign ambassadors. Her client list reads like a who's who of people who value privacy above publicity and results above recognition." She turned back to face the room. The kind of people who would be very interested to know that her own family tried to have her committed to a mental health facility based on their uninformed assumptions about her capabilities. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. My family's social and professional networks overlapped significantly with the world of wealthy, powerful people who valued discretion and loyalty. If word got out that they'd tried to institutionalize someone who moved in those circles, someone who was trusted with sensitive transactions and confidential information, the damage to their reputations would be severe and lasting. "Now then," Gloria continued, settling back into her chair with the satisfied air of someone who'd just established the ground rules for a negotiation, "let's discuss this intervention you've planned." My father cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain some semblance of authority in his own home. "Obviously, if we'd known about Joanne's circumstances, we would have approached this differently. Would you? How so?" "Well, we were acting out of concern. Family concern. If she's been successful, that's wonderful, but her behavior has still been unusual." "Unusual how?" "The secretiveness. The lack of communication. The way she's pulled away from family gatherings and obligations." Gloria's eyebrows rose slightly. "You mean the way she's avoided situations where she was consistently dismissed, belittled, and treated as a burden?" "That's not how we... Isn't it?" Gloria's voice cut across his protest. "Let me share my perspective on Joanne's behavior, since I've been observing this family dynamic for quite some time." She opened her folder again and pulled out what looked like a handwritten list. "For the past 5 years, Joanne has attended every major family gathering. She's been polite, pleasant, and engaged, despite being seated at the children's table well into her 30s, despite having her career dismissed as a hobby, despite being treated like the family charity case." She looked up from the list. "During that same period, she has quietly helped finance Lucan's business expansion, covered Silwyn's medical bills after her surgery 2 years ago, and made the down payment on Conan's house." The silence that followed this revelation was different from the others. This one was heavy with shame and recognition, and the dawning understanding of just how badly they'd misjudged the situation. She did all of this anonymously, through intermediaries, because she knew that if you realized the money was coming from her, you'd either refuse it or find ways to diminish her contribution. Better to let you believe it was insurance settlements or lucky investments or generous friends. I watched my family's faces as they processed this information. Lucan was staring at his hands, probably remembering how proud he'd been of his business, success, how he'd attributed it to his MBA and his strategic thinking. Silwyn looked like she might cry, possibly remembering her relief when those medical bills were mysteriously resolved by what she'd been told was an error in her insurance coverage. So when you talk about her secretiveness, Gloria continued, what you're really describing is someone who learned that the people who should have supported her success instead diminished it, and who adapted by finding ways to help her family without giving them opportunities to diminish her contributions. She closed the folder with a decisive snap. Which brings us to Dr. Rowena Thalrick and this facility where you've arranged to have Joanne treated for her apparent instability. My father shifted uncomfortably. Obviously, we'll need to reconsider. Oh, I think we should absolutely follow through with your plan. In fact, I think we should call Dr. Thalrick right now and let her know that the family is ready to proceed. The confusion in the room was palpable. Lucan looked between Gloria and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle, with missing pieces. But I thought you were here to stop. Gloria smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. Oh, I'm not here to stop anything. I'm here to make sure everyone understands exactly what's going to happen next. She reached for her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. Dr. Thalrick, you said. The one who specializes in helping people transition to more stable living situations? Mother, I don't think... No, this is perfect. Joanne clearly needs professional guidance about how to handle family relationships. Specifically, how to handle family members who try to manipulate and control her through false psychiatric commitments. She found the contact and held up her phone. And I think Dr. Thalrick will be very interested to hear about the family dynamics that led to this intervention. The financial control, the emotional manipulation, the systematic dismissal of someone's achievements and autonomy. You wouldn't, my mother whispered. Wouldn't I? Let's find out. Gloria's finger hovered over the call button, and I realized that everything that had happened up to this point had been preparation. The revelations about my success, the demonstrations of my family's ignorance and assumptions, the systematic dismantling of their justifications, all of it had been building to this moment. This was where the real confrontation would begin. Unless, Gloria said, her finger still poised over the call button, someone has something they'd like to say to Joanne before we proceed. Some acknowledgement they'd like to make, some apologies they'd like to offer. She looked around the room, her gaze settling on each family member in turn, giving them the opportunity to speak, to acknowledge what they'd done, to take responsibility for the harm they'd tried to cause. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of 32 years of misunderstanding, dismissal, and casual cruelty disguised as family concern. And in that silence, I realized that whatever happened next would fundamentally change the nature of my relationship with these people forever. There would be no going back to the old dynamic, no pretending that this Thanksgiving dinner had been just another family gathering gone slightly wrong. The reckoning had begun. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and then Gloria's finger moved toward the call button on her phone. That small motion seemed to break whatever spell had been holding my family frozen in their chairs. Wait, my father said, his voice hoarse. Please, there's no need to involve Dr. Thalrick. Gloria paused, her finger hovering millimeters from the screen. Isn't there? I thought you were convinced that Joanne needed professional intervention, that she was unstable, unreliable, possibly dangerous to herself. We were mistaken, my mother said quickly. Obviously, we had incomplete information. Incomplete information, Gloria repeated, as if tasting the phrase. Is that what we're calling it? I could see the calculation happening behind my parents' eyes. They were realizing that everything they thought they knew about power dynamics in this family had just shifted fundamentally. The daughter they'd been trying to control wasn't just successful, she was their economic superior. And more than that, she had the backing of the one person in the Hayes family hierarchy who truly couldn't be challenged. But Gloria wasn't finished. She set her phone down on the coffee table, the screen still displaying Dr. Thalrich's contact information, a constant reminder of how close my family had come to crossing a line they couldn't uncross. Before we dismiss Dr. Thalrich entirely, she said, settling back into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who held all the cards, I think we should discuss what really happened here tonight, the full scope of this intervention. She turned her attention to me for the first time since she'd arrived, her expression shifting from predatory satisfaction to something closer to maternal concern. Joanne, would you like to tell them about the gravy? The question landed like a physical blow. I saw my mother's face go pale, saw my father's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. They thought I hadn't noticed. They thought I'd been too upset, too distracted by the intervention to pay attention to what was happening to my food. The gravy, I repeated, my voice steadier than I felt. Yes, dear, the gravy that your mother was so careful to prepare specially for you. The one she stirred so thoughtfully while you were in the bathroom. All eyes turned to my mother, who was now gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything, Gloria said pleasantly. I'm stating a fact. You put medication in Joanne's food without her knowledge or consent. Specifically, you crushed up anxiety medication and mixed it into her gravy, hoping to sedate her enough to make tomorrow's transport to Dr. Thalrich's facility easier to manage. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dahlia gasped audibly, one hand flying to her mouth. Conan looked like he was having a professional crisis, probably calculating the legal implications of what had just been described. Even Aunt Sylvan seemed shocked, though whether by the action itself or by the fact that it had been discovered, I couldn't tell. We would never, my father began, but Gloria cut him off with a raised hand. Please don't insult my intelligence, Kelvin, or Joanne's for that matter. Did you really think she wouldn't notice? A woman who's built her career on attention to detail, who can spot a forgery from across a room, who's trained herself to read people and situations because her livelihood depends on it? She reached into her purse and pulled out a small glass vial, the kind used for scientific samples. The gravy, incidentally, is being tested as we speak. A friend of mine runs a private laboratory. Very discreet, very thorough. We should have results within the hour. My mother's face had gone from pale to gray. How did I get a sample of the gravy? I didn't. Joanne did. While you were all enjoying your family bonding time in the living room, she was in the kitchen collecting evidence. Because unlike you, she understands that when someone tries to drug you, the appropriate response is documentation, not denial. I had indeed collected the sample, using a small spoon to transfer some of the tainted gravy into a container I'd found in the kitchen pantry. Not because I'd known Gloria was coming, but because some instinct for self-preservation had kicked in when I'd realized what my mother had done. She called me from the kitchen, Gloria continued, while you were all discussing her mental state and planning her involuntary commitment. She told me what had happened, what you were trying to do, and asked for my help. And you came running, Lucan said, his voice bitter with the realization that his sister had allies he'd never known about. Of course I came running. Someone was trying to drug and institutionalize my business partner, my protege, my heir. The last word hit the room like a thunderbolt. Heir. Not just business partner, not just board member, but heir to the Hayes family fortune that had been built over 3 generations. Heir, my father repeated weakly. Did you think I was going? To live forever, Kelvin. Did you think I hadn't been watching the next generation, evaluating who among my grandchildren had the intelligence, the discretion, the strategic thinking necessary to manage what I've built? She gestured toward me with obvious pride. Joanne has spent the past 5 years proving herself, not just in business, but in judgment, in integrity, in the ability to make hard decisions and live with the consequences. What about Lucan? Aunt, Sylvan asked, as if she was advocating for a favorite nephew. He's got an MBA, business experience. Gloria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Lucan has a degree and a title, and an impressive ability to repeat what he's heard other people say. He's never generated an original idea in his life, never taken a real risk, never built anything that didn't depend on family connections and inherited advantages. The blow to Lucan's ego was visible. He'd built his entire identity around being the business success of the family, the one who'd followed the traditional path to respectability and achievement. To have his accomplishments dismissed so casually, so accurately, left him looking like a deflated balloon. Joanne, on the other hand, Gloria continued, has built something from nothing. She's created value where none existed before, developed relationships based on merit rather than inheritance, proven herself in markets where the Hayes name means nothing and results mean everything. She stood up and walked over to where I was, sitting, placing one hand on my shoulder with unmistakable maternal pride. She's also demonstrated loyalty, discretion, and judgment. When she learned about Lucan's business difficulties, she helped anonymously rather than using the situation to gain leverage. When Sylvan needed medical support, she provided it without demanding recognition or gratitude. When this family treated her like a burden, she continued to contribute to their welfare because she understood that family obligations transcend personal slights. The weight of their ingratitude was settling over my family like a heavy blanket. I could see them processing the full scope of what they'd done, not just tonight, but for years. They'd taken my help while dismissing my capabilities, benefited from my success while treating me like a failure, accepted my support while planning my destruction. So let me be very clear about the current situation, Gloria said, her voice taking on the formal tone she used when conducting business. Joanne controls 40% of the Hayes family trust as of last month. I control another 40%. Together, we represent a controlling majority in all family business decisions. She let that sink in before continuing. The remaining 20% is divided among the rest of you, 5% each for Kelvin, Veronica, Lucan, and Sylvan, which means that any decisions about family assets, family properties, family income, family business interests require our approval. My father looked like he was doing math in his head, probably calculating exactly how much of his annual income depended on dividends from the family trust, how much of his lifestyle was funded by decisions made by the people he'd just tried to have institutionalized. Your house, Gloria said, as if reading his thoughts, is owned by the trust. Your country club membership, your cars, Veronica's shopping allowances, Lucan's business loans, Sylvan's travel budget, all of it flows from decisions made by the trust board. She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just laid out a winning hand in poker, a trust board that is now controlled by the woman you tried to drug and commit to a psychiatric facility. The room fell silent except for the sound of my mother's ragged breathing and the grandfather clock continuing its steady tick-tick-tick, marking time that seemed to have stopped for everyone except the clock itself. Dahlia was staring at Lucan, with an expression that suggested she was rapidly recalculating her interest in dating someone who'd just been revealed as both financially dependent on his sister and professionally inferior to her. Conan was looking at his phone, probably researching the legal implications of what had just been described. Aunt Sylvan was staring at her hands, possibly running through years of casual dismissal and trying to figure out how much of her lifestyle had been subsidized by the niece she'd consistently patronized. Now, Gloria said, settling back into her chair with the air of someone who'd successfully conducted a hostile takeover. Let's discuss Dr. Thalrick and this intervention you've planned. She picked up her phone again, and this time no one moved. to stop her. I think she'll be very interested to hear about a family that tried to have a successful businesswoman committed based on their ignorance of her actual circumstances. I think she'll be particularly interested in the drugging aspect. That adds a criminal element that makes the whole situation much more serious. Please, my mother whispered. We made a mistake. We understand that now. We'll call Dr. Thalrick and cancel the arrangements. Will you? And what will you tell her? That you were mistaken about your daughter's mental state? That you didn't do proper research before trying to have her institutionalized? That you attempted to sedate her without her knowledge to make the process easier? Each question hit like a separate blow. There was no way to cancel the arrangements without explaining why they were being canceled. No way to explain without admitting to behavior that was not just wrong, but potentially criminal. Or, Gloria said, her voice becoming conversational, again, we could handle this differently. She set the phone down and looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member in turn. We could use this as a learning experience. An opportunity for everyone to reconsider their assumptions about family dynamics, about success, about respect. What kind of learning experience? My father asked warily. Gloria smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in the expression, though it was tempered with steel, the kind where everyone acknowledges what really happened here tonight. Where apologies are offered and accepted, where new boundaries are established and respected, where this family starts functioning like a family instead of like a hierarchy, designed to diminish anyone who doesn't conform to narrow definitions of acceptable achievement. She paused, letting the weight of the proposal settle. Or we can call Dr. Thalrick and let her professional opinion determine whether the people who tried to drug and institutionalize a successful businesswoman are suitable guardians of anyone's mental health. The choice was stark and unmistakable. Acknowledge their mistakes and change their behavior, or face the professional and legal consequences of what they'd tried to do. In the silence that followed, I realized that this moment would define my relationship with my family for the rest of our lives. Everything that had happened before tonight, all the dismissal, all the condescension, all the casual cruelty disguised as concern, had led to this reckoning. The question now was whether they were capable of change or whether the revelation of their powerlessness would simply make them more resentful of the person who'd exposed it. Either way, I was no longer the family disappointment sitting at the children's table, hoping for scraps of approval from people who'd never understood my worth. I was the person who held their future in my hands. And tomorrow, we would all find out what I intended to do with that power. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. I watched my family's faces as they processed their options, admit to years of wrongdoing and systematic dismissal, or face the professional and legal consequences of trying to drug and institutionalize someone who now controlled their financial security. My father was the first to break. His shoulders sagged as if the weight of maintaining his authority had finally become too heavy to bear. "We owe you an apology," he said, the words coming out rough and reluctant. "All of us. We were wrong about you, wrong about your life, wrong about everything." It was a start, but Gloria's expression remained unchanged. She'd spent decades in business negotiations where initial concessions were just the opening moves in longer games. "Go on," she said simply. "I don't know how to explain it," my mother added, her voice trembling with something that might have been genuine emotion. "We thought we were protecting you. We thought you were struggling, that you needed our help." "You thought I was a failure," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since Gloria had arrived. "You thought I was embarrassing the family name, wasting my life, being irresponsible." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, we did think that." The admission hung between us like a confession in church, raw, honest, and impossible to take back. Lucan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably realizing that his girlfriend had just witnessed The complete dismantling of everything he'd told her about his successful family dynamics and his struggling sister. "I told Dahlia you were a burden," he said, not looking at me. "I told her you were always asking for money, always causing drama, always making family gatherings difficult with your problems." Dahlia's face had gone through several color changes during this conversation, and she was now staring at Lucan like she was seeing him for the first time. "You told me she was unstable, that she'd been in and out of treatment programs." "That was never true," I said, my voice steady despite the hurt that was finally beginning to surface. "None of it was ever true." Aunt Silwyn cleared her throat delicately. "We weren't trying to be cruel, Joanne. We genuinely believed we were helping. When people don't communicate clearly about their circumstances..." "Don't," Gloria's voice cut across, the attempted rationalization like a blade. "Don't turn this into Joanne's failure to communicate. She tried to share her work with you countless times. You dismissed it, changed the subject, or offered unsolicited advice about more practical career choices. She was right, of course. I remembered dozens of conversations where I'd tried to explain a successful sale, an interesting client, a breakthrough in my business development, only to have the topic redirected to when I was going to get a real job or settle down with someone appropriate. "We want to make this right," my father said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who'd realized they were in a much weaker position than they'd understood. "However we can make this right, Gloria smiled, but it wasn't particularly warm. "Making it right starts with understanding what you actually did wrong, not just tonight, but for years." She stood up and began pacing slowly around the room, like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "You systematically dismissed your daughter's achievements because they didn't fit your narrow definition of success. You treated her like a charity case while she was quietly supporting your lifestyles. You planned to have her institutionalized, based on assumptions rather than evidence." Each point landed like a physical blow. I could see my family members flinching as Gloria laid out the full scope of their behavior. "But most importantly," she continued, "you drugged her food without her consent and tried to have her committed against her will. Those aren't misunderstandings or communication failures. Those are serious violations of her autonomy and potentially criminal acts." Conan, who had been silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke up with the careful precision of someone trying to minimize legal exposure. "If we call Dr. Thalrick immediately and explain that there was a misunderstanding, that we received new information about Joanne's circumstances..." "You'll explain what exactly?" Gloria asked. "That you tried to have someone committed without proper evidence? That you put medication in her food? That you made medical decisions for a competent adult without her consent?" The legal implications were becoming clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't just a family drama that could be resolved with apologies and promises to do better. There were potential criminal charges, professional consequences, and civil liability issues that couldn't be made to disappear with good intentions. "What do you want from us?" my mother asked, and for the first time in my memory, she sounded genuinely humble. I looked around the room at the faces of people who had shaped my childhood, influenced my adolescence, and continued to undermine my adulthood until tonight. They were waiting for me to decide their fate, these people who had never believed I was capable of deciding my own. "I want you to understand," I said finally, "that I am not the person you thought I was. I never was. I've been successful despite your lack of support, not because of it. I've been generous despite your lack of gratitude, not because I owed you anything." I stood up, feeling steadier than I had all evening. "I want you to understand that every family gathering where you seated me at the children's table, every conversation where you dismissed my work, every suggestion that I needed to grow up and get serious about life, all of it was based on ignorance and arrogance." The shame in the room was palpable now. Even Dahlia looked uncomfortable, probably realizing that she'd been complicit in this. Evening's intervention attempt. And I want you to understand, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, that the reason I never told you about my success wasn't because I was secretive or uncommunicative. It was because I learned through years of experience that sharing good news with you meant having it minimized, sharing challenges meant having them blamed on my poor choices, and sharing anything meaningful meant having the conversation redirected to how I could be more like Lucan. My brother winced at the mention of his name, probably realizing that his position as the family success story had just evaporated permanently. Gloria returned to her chair, clearly satisfied with how the reckoning was proceeding. So the question becomes, what happens now? Do we call Dr. Thalrick and let her make professional judgments about the people who tried to have Joanne committed? Or do we find a way forward that acknowledges the harm that's been done and ensures it doesn't happen again? The choice was still theirs to make, but the power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. They were no longer the family authorities deciding my fate. They were the defendants in a case where I held all the evidence and controlled all the consequences. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I belonged in the Hayes family hierarchy, at the top. 3 months later, I sat in the same dining room where my family had tried to destroy my life, but everything was different now. The formal table settings were gone, replaced by a simple wooden table that encouraged conversation rather than performance. The photographs lining the hallway now included my gallery exhibitions, my business achievements, my real life instead of the sanitized version they'd preferred. My parents entered together, both looking older but somehow more genuine than I remembered. The desperate need to maintain appearances had been replaced by something that resembled actual humility. "How was the Denver opening?" my mother asked, and for the first time in memory, she waited for my actual answer instead of immediately changing. The subject: successful. 3 pieces sold on opening night, and I have 2 new corporate clients interested in commissioning work. She nodded with what appeared to be genuine interest. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm proud of you." The words I'd waited 32 years to hear, finally spoken without conditions or qualifications. Lucan arrived next, alone. Dahlia had ended their relationship 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, apparently deciding that dating someone who'd systematically lied about his family dynamics wasn't worth the complications. He'd moved back in with my parents temporarily while restructuring his business, this time with transparent accounting and realistic projections instead of family subsidies disguised as investments. "I called Dr. Thalrick," he said quietly as he took his seat. "Explained that there had been a family misunderstanding, that professional intervention wasn't necessary." How did she respond? She asked a lot of questions about family dynamics and decision-making processes. I think she suspected something wasn't quite right about the original referral. That was probably an understatement. Mental health professionals were trained to recognize manipulation and coercion, and our family's sudden reversal on the commitment plan had likely raised several red flags about our motivations and methods. Gloria arrived precisely on time, as always, but her demeanor was more relaxed than it had been 3 months ago. The crisis had passed, the power structures had been clarified, and the family was slowly learning to function under its new hierarchy. "Any word from the lab about the gravy sample?" my father asked, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who understood he was asking about evidence of his own wrongdoing. "Positive for diazepam," Gloria replied matter-of-factly. "Enough to cause significant sedation in someone your daughter's size. More than enough to make involuntary transport to a medical facility much easier to manage." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. They were learning to sit with the consequences of their actions instead of immediately trying to minimize or justify them. "We've been talking," my mother said finally, "about how to rebuild trust. How to show you that we understand what we did wrong and why it can never happen again." I looked around the table at faces that were still familiar, but fundamentally changed by recent events. They were waiting for my guidance now, seeking my approval, hoping for my forgiveness. For 32 years, I'd dreamed of this moment. The moment when my family would finally recognize my worth, finally treat me with respect, finally understand that their assumptions about my life had been catastrophically wrong. But now that it was happening, I realized something unexpected. Their validation didn't matter as much as I'd thought it would. "Here's what I learned through all of this," I said, my voice steady and clear. I spent decades trying to earn respect from people who had already decided I wasn't worth respecting. I wasted years seeking approval from people who had no interest in understanding who I really was. I paused, making eye contact with each of them. The truth is, you don't get to choose whether you're valued by your family, but you do get to choose whether their opinion defines your worth. That was the real lesson, the one that applied far beyond this dining room, beyond this family, beyond this specific story of Thanksgiving dinner gone wrong. Somewhere out there, someone else was sitting at a family gathering being told they were wasting their life, not living up to their potential, making poor choices that disappointed people who claimed to love them. To that person, I wanted to say, you don't need their permission to be extraordinary. You don't need their understanding to change the world. You don't need their approval to know your own worth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop seeking validation from people who are determined not to give it. And sometimes justice isn't about making them pay for underestimating you. Sometimes it's about finally understanding that their estimation was never what mattered in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.